The Work of Representation, Stuart Hall, Chapter 1. In this chapter, we will be concentrating on one of the key processes in the cultural circuit, the practices of representation. The aim of this chapter is to introduce you to this topic and to explain what it is about and why we give it such importance in cultural studies. The concept of representation has come to occupy a new and important place in the study of culture. Representation connects meaning and language to culture. But what exactly do people mean by it? What does representation have to do with culture and meaning? One common sense usage of the term is as follows. Representation means using language to say something meaningful about or to represent the world meaningfully to other people. You may ask, well, is that all? Well, yes and no. Representation is an essential part of the process by which meaning is produced and exchanged between members of a culture. It does involve the use of language, of signs and images which stand for or represent things. But this is far from simple or straightforward processes, as you will soon discover. How does the concept of representation connect meaning and language to culture? In order to explore this connection further, we will look at a number of different theories about how language is used to represent the world. Here, we will be drawing a distinction between three different accounts or theories: the reflective, the intentional, and the constructionist approaches to representation. Does language simply reflect a meaning which already exists out there in the world of objects, peoples, and events? Reflective. Does language express only what the speaker or writer or printer wants to say, his or her personally intended meaning? Intentional. Or is meaning constructed in and through language? Constructionist. You will learn more in a moment about these three approaches. Most of the chapter will be spent exploring the constructionist approach, because it is this perspective which has had the most significant impact on cultural studies in recent years. This chapter chooses to examine two major variants or models of the constructionist approach: the semiotic approach, greatly influenced by the great Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and the discursive approach associated with the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Later chapters in this book will take up these two theories again, among others, so you will have an opportunity to consolidate your understanding of them and to apply them to different areas of analysis. Other chapters will introduce theoretical paradigms, which apply constructionist approaches in different ways of that semiotics and Foucault. All, however, put in question the very nature of representation. We turn to this question first. What does the word representation really mean in this context? What does the process of representation involve? How does representation work? To put it briefly, representation is the production of meaning through language. The shorter Oxford English Dictionary suggests two relevant meanings for the word. To represent something is to describe or depict it, to call it up in the mind by description or portrayal or imagination, to place a likeness of it before us in our mind or in the senses, as for example, in the sentence, "This picture represents the murder of Abel by Cain." To represent, or the second definition, to represent also means to symbolize, stand for, to be a specimen of, or to substitute for, as in the sentence, "In Christianity, the cross represents the suffering and crucifixion of Christ." The figures in the painting stand in place of, and at the same time stand for the story of Abel and Cain. Likewise, the cross consists of two wooden planks nailed together, but in the context of Christian belief and teaching, it takes on, symbolizes, or comes to stand for a wider set of meanings about the crucifixion of the Son of God, and is a concept we can put into words and pictures. Here is a simple exercise about representation. Look at any familiar object in the room. You will immediately recognize what it is. But how do you know what the object is? What does recognize mean? Now try to make yourself conscious of what you are doing. Observe what is going on as you do it. You recognize what it is because your thought process decode your visual perception of that object in terms of a concept of it which you have in your mind. This must be because if you look away from the object, you can still think about it by conjuring it up, as we say, in your mind's eye. Go on. Try to follow the process as it happens. There is the object, and there is the concept in your head which tells you what it is, what your visual image of it means. Now tell me what it is. Say it aloud. It's a lamp, or a table, or a book, or a phone, whatever. The concept of the object has passed through your mental representation of it to me, via the word for it which you have just used. The word stands for or represents the concept, and can be used to reference or designate either a real object in the world, or indeed even some imaginary object, like angels dancing on the head of a pin, which no one has ever actually seen. This is how you give meaning to things through language. This is how you make sense of the world of people, objects, events, and how you are able to express a complex thought about those things to other people, or communicate about them through language in ways which other people are able to understand. Why do we have to go through this complex process to represent our thoughts? If you put down a glass, you can only think with the concept of the glass. As the linguists are fond of saying, dogs bark, but the concept of a dog cannot bark or bite. You can't speak with the actual glass either. You can only speak with the word for glass. Glass, which is the linguistic sign which we use in English to refer to objects which you drink water out of. This is where representation comes in. Representation is the production of the meaning of the concepts in our minds through language. It is the link between concepts and language which enables us to refer to either the real world of objects, people, or events, or indeed to imaginary worlds of fictional objects, people, and events. So there are two two systems of representation involved involved. Period. First, there is the system by which all sorts of objects, people, and events are correlated with a set of concepts or mental representations which we carry around in our heads. Without them, we could not interpret the world meaningfully at all. In the first place, then, meaning depends on the system of concepts and images formed in our thoughts, which can stand for or represent the world, enabling us to refer to things both inside and outside our heads. Before we move on to look at the second system of representation, we should observe that what we have just said is a very simple version of a rather complex process. It is simple enough to see how we might form concepts for things we can perceive, people or material objects like chairs, tables, and desks. We also form concepts of rather obscure and abstract things, which we can't in any simple way see, feel, or touch. Think, for example, of our concepts of war, or death, or friendship, or love. And as we have remarked, We can also form concepts about things we have never seen and possibly can't or won't ever see, and about people and places we have plainly made up. We may have a clear concept of, say, angels, mermaids, God, the devil, or heaven and hell, or Middlemarch, the fictional provincial town in George Eliot's novel, or Elizabeth, the heroine of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We have called this a system of representation. That is because it consists not of individual concepts, but of different ways of organizing, clustering, arranging, and classifying concepts, and of establishing complex relations between them. For example, we use the principles of similarity and difference to establish relationships between concepts or to distinguish them from one another. Thus, I have an idea that in some respects, birds are like planes in the sky, based on the fact that they are similar because they both fly. But I also have an idea that in other respects they are different, because one is part of nature whilst the other is man-made. This mixing and matching of relations between concepts to form complex ideas and thoughts is possible because of our concepts are arranged into different classifying systems. In this example, the first is based on a distinction between flying and not flying, and the second is based on the distinction between natural and man-made. There are other principles of organization like this at work in all conceptual systems. For example, classifying according to sequence, which concept follows which, or causality, what causes what. I think it meant causality, sorry, and so on. The point is that we are talking about not just a random collection of concepts, but concepts organized, arranged, and classified into complex relations with one another. That is what our conceptual system actually is like. However, this does not determine the basic point. Meaning depends on the relationship between things in the world, people, objects, and events, real or fictional, and the conceptual system, which can operate as mental representations of them. Now it could be the case that the conceptual map which I carry around in my head is totally different from yours, in which case you and I would interpret or make sense of the world in totally different ways. We could be incapable of sharing our thoughts or expressing ideas about the world to each other. In fact, each of us probably does understand and interpret the world in a unique and individual way. However, we are able to communicate because we share broadly the same conceptual maps and thus make sense of or interpret the world in roughly similar ways. That is indeed what it means when we say we belong to the same culture. Because we interpret the world in roughly similar ways, we are able to build up a shared culture of meanings and thus construct a social world which we inhabit together. That is why culture is sometimes defined in terms of shared meanings or shared conceptual maps. See Ducray, Hall et al., 1997. However, a shared conceptual map is not enough. We must also be able to represent or exchange meanings and concepts, and we can only do that when we also have the access to a shared language. Language is therefore the second system of representation involved in the overall process of constructing meaning. Our shared conceptual map must be translated into a common language so that we can correlate our concepts and ideas with certain written words, spoken sounds, or visual images. The general term we use for words, sounds, or images which carry meanings is signs. These signs stand for or represent the concepts and the conceptual relations between them which we carry around in our heads, and together they make up the meaning systems of our culture. Signs are organized into languages, and it is the existence of common languages which enable us to translate our thoughts, concepts into words, sounds, or images, and then to use these, operating as a language to express meaning and communicate thoughts to other people. Remember that the term language is being used here in a very broad and inclusive way. The writing system or spoken system of a particular language are both obviously languages, but so are visual images, whether produced by hand, mechanical, electronic, digital, or some other means, when they are used to express meaning. And so are other things which aren't linguistic in any ordinary sense. The language of facial expressions or of gesture, for example, or the language of fashion, of clothes, or of traffic lights. Even music is language, with complex relations between different sounds and chords, though it is a very special case since it cannot easily be used to reference actual things or objects in the world, a point further elaborated by Indugray et al. 1997 and McKay et al. 1997. Any sound, word, image, or object which functions as a sign and is organized with other signs into a system which is capable of carrying and expressing meaning is, from this point of view, a language. It is in this sense that the model of meaning which I have been analyzing here is often described as a linguistic one, and that all the theories of meaning which follow this basic model are described as belonging to the linguistic turn in the social sciences and cultural studies. At the heart of the meaning process in culture, then, are two related systems of representation. The first enables us to give meaning to the world by constructing a set of correspondences or a chain of equivalencies between things, people, objects, events, abstract ideas, etc., and our system of concepts, our conceptual maps. The second depends on constructing a set of correspondences between our conceptual map and a set of signs, arranged or organized into various languages which stand for or represent those concepts. The relation between things, concepts, and signs lies at the heart of the production of meaning in language. The process between which links these three elements together is what we call representation. Just as people who belong to the same culture must share a broadly similar cultural map, so they must also share the same way of interpreting the signs of a language, for only in this way can meanings be effectively exchanged between people. But how do we know which concept stands for which thing, or which word effectively represents which concept? How do I know which sounds or images will carry through language the meaning of my concepts, and what I want to say with them to you? This may seem relatively simple in the case of visual signs, because the drawing, painting, camera, or TV image of a sheep bears a resemblance to the animal with a woolly coat grazing in a field to which I want to refer. Even so, we need to remind ourselves that a drawn or painted or digital version of a sheep is not exactly like a real sheep. For one thing, most images are in 2 dimensions, whereas the real sheep exists in 3 dimensions. Visual images, signs, even when they bear a close resemblance to the things that they refer to, are still signs. They carry meaning and thus have to be interpreted. In order to interpret them, we must have access to the 2 systems of representation discussed earlier, to a conceptual map which correlates to the sheep in the field with the concept of a sheep, and a language system which in visual language bears some resemblance to the real thing or looks like it in some way. This argument is clearest if we think of a cartoon drawing or an abstract painting of a sheep, where we need a very sophisticated conceptual and shared linguistic system to be certain that we are all reading the sign in the same way. Even then, we may find ourselves wondering whether it really is a picture of a sheep at all, as the relationship between the sign and its referent, so the referent to me means to the thing or the person being referred to. So, I'll read it again. As the relationship between the signs and its referent becomes less clear-cut, the meaning begins to slip and slide away from us into uncertainty. Meaning is no longer transparently passing from one person to another. So, even in the case of visual language, where the relationship between the concept and the sign seems fairly straightforward, the matter is far from simple. It is even more difficult with written or spoken language, where words do not look or sound anything like the things to which they refer. In part, this is because there are different kinds of signs. Visual signs are what are called iconic signs. That is, they bear in their form a certain resemblance to the object, person, or event to which they refer. A photograph of a tree reproduces some of the actual conditions of our visual representation in the visual sign. Written or spoken signs, on the other hand, are what is called indexical. They bear no obvious relationship to all the things to which they refer. The letters T, R, E, E do not look anything like trees in nature, nor does the word tree in English sound like real trees, if indeed they make any sound at all. The relationship in these systems of representation begin to sign the concept and the object to which they might be used to refer is entirely arbitrary. The word arbitrary, we mean that in principle any collection of letters or any sound in any order would do the trick equally well. Trees would not mind if we used the word street, trees written backwards to represent the concept of them. This is clear from the fact that in French, quite different letters and quite different sounds is used to refer to all appearances is the same thing, a real tree. And as far as we can tell, the same concept, a large plant that grows in nature. The French and English seem to be using the same concept, but the concept, which in English is represented by the word tree, is represented in French by the word arbre. I don't know. The question then is, how do people who belong to the same culture, who share the same conceptual map and who speak or write the same language, English, know that the arbitrary combination of letters and sounds that make up the word tree will stand for or represent the concept of a large plant that grows in nature? One possibility would be that the objects in the word themselves embody and fix in some way their true meaning. But it is not clear at all that real trees know that they are trees, and even less clear that they know that the word in English which represents the concept of themselves is written tree, whereas in French it is written arbre. As far as they are concerned, it could just all as well be written cow or vache, or indeed XYZ. Meaning is not the object or person or thing, nor is it in the word. It is we who fix the meaning so firmly after a while it becomes to seem natural and inevitable. The meaning is constructed by the system of representation. It is constructed and fixed by the code, which sets up the correlation between our conceptual system and our language system in such a way that every time we think of a tree, the code tells us to use the English word tree or the French word arbre. The code tells us that in our culture, that is, in our conceptual and language codes, the concept tree is represented by the letters T, R, E, E, arranged in a certain sequence, just as in Morse code, the sign for V, which in World War II Churchill made stand for or represent victory, is ... dash, and in the language of traffic lights, green is go and red is stop. One way of thinking about culture, then, is in terms of these shared conceptual maps, shared language systems, and the codes which govern the relationships of translation between them. Codes fix the relationships between concepts and signs. They stabilize meaning within different languages and cultures. They tell us which language to use to convey which idea. The reverse is also true. Codes tell us which concepts are being referred to when we hear or read which signs. By arbitrarily fixing the relationships between our conceptual system and our linguistic systems, remember linguistic in a broad sense, codes make it possible for us to speak to and to hear intelligibly and establish the ability, or the translatability between our concepts and our languages, which enables us meaning to pass from speaker to hearer and to be effectively communicated within a culture. This translatability is not given by nature or fixed by the gods. It is the result of a set of social conventions. It is fixed socially, fixed in culture. English or French or Hindi speakers have over time, and without conscious decision or choice, come to an unwritten agreement, a sort of unwritten cultural covenant that, in their various languages, certain signs will stand for or represent certain concepts. This is what children learn and how they become not simply biological individuals, but cultural subjects. They learn the system of conventions of representation, the codes of their language and culture, which equip them with the cultural know-how, enabling them to function as culturally competent subjects. Not because such knowledge is imprinted in their genes, but because they learn its conventions and so gradually become cultured persons, i.e., members of their culture. They unconsciously internalize the codes which allow them to express certain concepts and ideas through their systems of representation, writing, speech, gesture, visualization, and so on, and to interpret ideas which are communicated to them using the same systems. You may find it easier to understand now why meaning and language and representation are such crucial elements in the study of culture. To belong to a culture is to belong to roughly the same conceptual and linguistic universe, to know how concepts and ideas translate into different languages, and how language can be interpreted to refer to or reference the world. To share these things is to see the world from within the same conceptual map, and to make sense of it through the same language systems. Early anthropologists of language, like Sapir and Worf, took this insight to its logical extreme when they argued that we are all, as it were, locked into our cultural perspectives or mindsets, and that language is the best clue we have to that conceptual universe. This observation, when applied to all human cultures, lies at the root of what today we might think of as cultural cultural or linguistic relativism. You might like to think further about this question of how different cultures conceptually classify the world and what implications this has for meaning and representation. The English make a rather simple distinction between sleet and snow. The Inuit or Eskimos, who have to survive in a very different, more extreme and hostile climate, apparently have many more words for snow and snowy weather. Consider the list of Inuit terms for snow in the Scott Polar Research Institute Table 1.1. There are many more than in English, making much finer and more complex distinctions. The Inuit have a complex classificatory conceptual system for the weather compared with English. The novelist Peter Hoag, for example, writing about Greenland in his novel Miss Similar's Feeling for Snow, 1994, graphically describes the frazzle ice, which is kneaded together into a soapy mash called porridge ice, which gradually forms free-floating plates, pancake ice, which one cold noony hour on a Sunday freezes into a single solid sheet. Such distinctions are too fine and elaborate, even for the English, who are always talking about the weather. The question, however, is, do the Inuit actually experience snow differently from the English? Their language system suggests that they conceptualize the weather differently, but how far is our experience actually bounded by our linguistic and conceptual universe? The table will be I'll put a screenshot of the table here. I'm not going to narrate all of it. You can pause the video and take a look. One implication of this argument about cultural codes is that If meaning is the result not of something fixed out there in nature, but of our social, cultural, and linguistic conventions, then meaning can never be finally fixed. We can all agree to allow words to carry somewhat different meanings, as we have, for example, the word gay, or the use by young people of the word wicked as a term of approval. This book was clearly written in the 90s. Of course, there must be some fixing of meaning in language, or we would never be able to understand one another. We can't get up one morning and suddenly decide to represent the concept of a tree with the letters or the word X, Y, Z, or V, Y, X, Z, and expect people to follow what we are saying. On the other hand, there is no absolute or final fixing of meaning. Social and linguistic conventions do change over time. In the language of modern managerialism, what we used to call students, clients, patients, and passengers have all become customers. Linguistic codes vary significantly between one language and another. Many cultures do not have words for concepts which are normal and widely acceptable to us. Words constantly go out of common usage and new phrases are coined. Think, for example, of the use of the word downsizing to represent the process of firms laying people off of work. Even when the actual words remain stable, their connotations shift or they acquire a different nuance. The problem is especially acute in translation. For example, does the difference in English between now and understand correspond exactly? For example, does the difference in English between know and understand correspond exactly to and capture exactly the same conceptual distinction as the French make between savoir and connaître? I don't speak French. I'm sorry if I butchered that and you're a French speaker. I am not good at French. Perhaps, but can we be sure? The main point is that the meaning does not inhere. The main point is that meaning does not inhere in things in the world. It is constructed, produced. It is the result of signifying practice, a practice that produces meaning, that makes things mean. There are, broadly speaking, three approaches to explaining how representation of meaning through language works. We may call these reflective, the intentional, and the constructionist or constructivist approaches. You might think of each as an attempt to answer the questions: where do meanings come from, and how can we tell the true meaning of a word or image? In the reflective approach, meaning is thought to lie in the object, person, idea, or event in the real world, and language functions like a mirror to reflect the true meaning as it already exists in the world. As the poet Gertrude Stein once said, "A rose is a rose." In the 4th century BC, the Greeks used the notion of mimesis to explain how language, even drawing and painting, mirrored or imitated nature. They thought of Homer's great poem, the Iliad, as imitating a heroic series of events. So the theory which says that language works by simply reflecting or imitating the truth that is already there and fixed in the world is sometimes called mimetic, like mimic. Of course, there is a certain obvious truth to mimetic theories of representation and language. As we've pointed out, visual signs do bear some relationship to the shape and texture of the objects which they represent. But, as we also pointed out earlier, a two-dimensional visual image of a rose is a sign. It should not be confused with the real plant with thorns and blooms growing in the garden. Remember also that there are many words, sounds, and images which we fully well understand, but which are entirely fictional or fantasy, and refer to the worlds which are wholly imaginary, including many people now think. The most of the... Hey! I don't like how he wrote this. Including many people now think most of the Iliad. Of course, I can use the word rose to refer to real, actual plants growing in a garden, as we have said before. But this is because I know the code which links the concept with a particular word or image. I cannot think or speak or draw with an actual rose. And if someone says to me that there is no such word as rose for a plant in their culture, the actual plant in the garden cannot resolve the failure of communication between us. Within the conventions of the different language codes we are using, we are both right, and for us to understand each other, one of us must learn the code linking the flower with the word for it in the other's culture. The second approach to meaning in representation argues the opposite case. It holds that it is the speaker, the author, who imposes his or her unique meaning on the world through language. Words mean what the author intends they should mean. This is the intentional approach. Again, there is some point to this argument since we all, as individuals, do use language to convey or communicate things which are special or unique to us, to our way of seeing the world. However, as a general theory of representation through language, the intentional approach is also flawed. We cannot be the sole or unique source of meanings in language, since that would mean that we could express ourselves in entirely private languages. But the essence of language is communication, and that in turn depends on shared linguistic conventions and shared codes. Language can never be wholly a private game. Our private intended meanings, however personal to us, have to enter into the rules, codes, and conventions of language to be shared and understood. Language is a social system through and through. This means that our private thoughts have to negotiate with all the other meanings for words or images which have been stored in language, which our use of the language system will inevitably trigger into action. The third approach recognizes this public, social character of language. It acknowledges that neither things in themselves nor the individual users of language can fix meaning in language. Things don't mean, we construct meaning using representation. Let me try that again. Things don't mean, we construct meaning using representational systems, concepts, and signs. Hence, it is called the constructivist or constructionist approach to meaning in language. According to this approach, we must not confuse the material world, where things and people exist, and the symbolic practices and processes through which representation, meaning, and language operate. Constructivists do not deny the existence of the material world. However, it is not the material world which conveys meaning. It is the language system, or whatever system we are using to represent our concepts. It is social actors who use the conceptual systems of their culture and the linguistic and other representational systems to construct meaning, to make the world meaningful, and to communicate about that world meaningfully to others. Of course, signs may also have a material dimension. Representational systems consist of the actual sounds we make with our vocal cords, the images we make on light-sensitive paper with cameras, the marks we leave with paint on canvas, the digital impulses we transmit electronically. Representation is a practice, a kind of work, which uses material objects and effects. But the meaning depends not on the material quality of the sign, but on its symbolic function. It is because a particular sound or word stands for, symbolizes, or represents a concept that it can function in language as a sign and convey meaning, or as the construction, non so che, there it is, or as the constructionists say, signify, sign, I, phi. The simplest example of this point, which is critical for an understanding of how languages function as representational systems, is the famous traffic lights. A traffic light is a machine which produces different colored lights in a sequence. The effect of light of different wavelengths on the eye, which is a natural and material phenomenon, produces the sensation of different colors. Now these things certainly do exist in the material world, but it is our culture which breaks the spectrum of light into different colors, distinguishes them from one another, and attaches names, red, green, yellow, blue, to them. We use a way of classifying the color spectrum to create colors which are different from one another. We represent or symbolize the different colors and classify them according to different color concepts. This is the conceptual color system of our culture. We say our culture because, of course, other cultures may divide the color spectrum differently. What's more, they certainly use different actual words or letters to identify different colors. What we call red, the French call rouge, and so on. This is the linguistic code, the one which correlates certain words, signs, with certain colors, concepts, and thus enables us to communicate about colors to other people using the language of colors. But how do we use this representational or symbolic system to regulate the traffic? Colors do not have any true or fixed meaning in that sense. Red does not mean stop in nature, any more than green means go. In other settings, red may stand for, symbolize, or represent blood or danger or communism, and green may represent Ireland or the countryside or environmentalism. Even these meanings can change. In the language of electric plugs, red used to mean the connection with the positive charge, but this was arbitrarily and without explanation changed to brown. But then for many years, the producers of plugs had to attach a slip of paper telling people that the code or convention had changed. Otherwise, how would they know? Red and green work in the language of traffic lights because stop and go are the meanings which have been assigned to them in our culture by the code or conventions governing this language. And this code is widely known and almost universally obeyed in our culture and cultures like ours, though we can well imagine other cultures which did not possess the code, in which this language would be a complete mystery. Let us stay with the example for a moment to explore a little further how, according to the constructionalist approach to representation, colors and the language of traffic lights work as a signifying or representational system. Recall the two representational systems we spoke of earlier. First, there is the conceptual map of colors in our culture, the way colors are distinguished from one another, classified and arranged in our mental universe. Secondly, there are the ways words or images are correlated with color, as in our language, our linguistic color codes. Actually, of course, a language of colors consists of more than just the visual words for different points on the color spectrum. It also depends on how they function in relation to one another, the sorts of things which are governed by grammar and syntax in written or spoken languages, which allow us to express rather complex ideas. In the language of traffic lights, it is the sequence and position of the colors, as well as the colors themselves, which enable them to carry meaning, and thus functions as signs. Does it matter which colors we use? No, the constructionists argue. This is because what signifies is not the colors themselves, but A, the fact that they are different and can be distinguished from one another, and B, the fact that they are organized into a particular sequence. Red, followed by green, with sometimes a warning amber in between, which says in effect, get ready, light's about to change. Constructionists put this point in the following way. What signifies, what carries meaning, they argue, is not each color in itself, nor even the concept or word for it. It is the difference between red and green which signifies. This is a very important principle in general about representation and meaning, and we shall return to it on more than one occasion in the chapters that follow. Think about it in these terms. If you can't differentiate between red and green, you can't use them to mean stop and the other to go. In the same way, it is only the difference between the letters P and T which enable the word sheep to be linked in the English language code to the concept of the animal with 4 legs and a woolly coat, and the word sheet to the material that we use to cover ourselves in bed at night. In principle, any combination of colors, like any collection of letters in written language or sounds in spoken language, would do, provided they are sufficiently different not to be confused. Constructionists express this idea by saying that all signs are arbitrary. Arbitrary means that there is no natural relationship between the sign and its meaning or concept. Since red only means stop, because that is how the code works, in principle any color would do, including green. It is the code that fixes the meaning, not the color itself. This also has wider implications for the theory of representation and meaning in language. It means that signs themselves cannot fix meaning. Instead, meaning depends on the relation between a sign and a concept which is fixed by a code. Meaning, the constructionists would say it is relational. Why not test this point about the arbitrary nature of the sign and the importance of the code for yourself? Construct a code to govern the movement of traffic using 2 colors, yellow and blue, as in the following. When the yellow light is showing. Now add an instruction allowing pedestrians and cyclists only to cross using pink. Provided the code tells us clearly how to read or interpret each color, and everyone agrees to interpret them in the same way, any color will do. These are just colors, just as the word sheep is just a jumble of letters. In French, the same animal is referred to using the very different linguistic sign mouton. Signs are arbitrary, their meanings are fixed by codes. As we said earlier, traffic lights are machines, and colors are the material effect of light waves on the retina of the eye. But objects, things, can also function as signs, provided they have been assigned a concept and meaning within our cultural and linguistic codes. As signs, they work symbolically, they represent concepts and signify. Their effects, however, are felt in the material and social world. Red and green function in the language of traffic lights as signs, but they have real material and social effects. They regulate the social behavior of drivers, and without them, there would be many more traffic accidents and road intersections. We have come a long way in exploring the nature of representation. It is time to summarize what we have learned about the constructionist approach to representation through language. Representation is the production of meaning through language. In representation, constructionists argue we use signs organized into languages of different kinds to communicate meaningfully with others. Languages can use signs to symbolize, stand for, or reference objects, people, and events in the so-called real world. But they can also refer to imaginary things and fantasy worlds or abstract ideas which are not in any obvious sense part of our material world. There is no simple relationship or reflection, imitation, or one-to-one correspondence between language and the real world. The world is not accurately or otherwise reflected in the mirror of language. Language does not work like a mirror, meaning it is produced within language in and through various representational systems which, for convenience, we call languages. Meaning is produced by the practice, the work of representation. It is constructed through signifying, i.e. meaning-producing practices. How does this take place? In fact, it depends on 2 different but related systems of representation. First, the concepts which are formed in the mind function as a system of mental representation which classifies and organizes the world into meaningful categories. If we have a concept for something, we can say we know its meaning, but we cannot communicate this meaning without a second system of representation, a language. Language consists of signs organized into various relationships, but signs can only convey meaning. If we possess codes which allow us to translate our concepts into language and vice versa, these codes are crucial for meaning and representation. They do not exist in nature, but they are the result of social conventions. They are a crucial part of our culture, our shared maps of meaning, which we learn and unconsciously internalize as we become members of our culture. This constructionist approach to language thus introduces the symbolic domain of life, where words and things function as signs, into the very heart of social life itself. All this may seem rather abstract, but we can quickly demonstrate its relevance by making example from paintings. Below or on screen is the still life painting Quince Garbage, Melon and Cucumber, painted by Juan Sanchez, a Spanish still life painter. It seems as if the painter has made every effort to use the language of painting accurately to reflect these four objects, to capture or imitate nature. Is this then an example of a reflective or mimetic form of representation, a painting reflecting the true meaning of what already exists in Coton's kitchen, or can we find the operation of certain codes, the language of painting used to produce a certain meaning? Start with the question, what does the painting mean to you? What is it saying? Then go on to ask, how is it saying it? How does representation work in this painting? Write down any thoughts at all that come to you on looking at the painting. What do these objects say to you? Write down any thoughts at all that come to you on looking at the painting. What do these objects say to you? What meanings do they trigger off? Now read the edited abstract from an analysis of a still life by the art critic and theorist Norman Bryanson, included as a reading at the end of this chapter. Don't be concerned at this stage if the language seems a little bit difficult and you don't understand all the terms. Pick out the main points about the way representation works in the painting according to Bryanson. Bryanson is by no means the only critic of Coton's painting, and certainly doesn't provide the only correct reading of it. That's not the point. The point of the example is that he helps us to see how, even in the still life, the language of painting does not function simply to reflect or imitate a meaning which is already there in nature, but to produce meanings. The act of painting is a signifying practice. Take note, in particular, of what Bryan says about the following points. 1. The way that the painting invites you, the viewer, to look, what he calls its mode of seeing. In part, the function of the language is to position you, the viewer, in a certain relation to meaning, the relationship to food which is posed by the painting. I think something was skipped, but number 3, how, according to Bryson, mathematical form is used by Coton to distort the painting so as to bring out a particular meaning. Can a distorted meaning in painting be true? 4. The meaning of the language between scriptural and geometric space. The language of painting creates its own kind of space. If necessary, work through the extract again, picking up these specific points. The social constructionist view of language and representation, which we have been discussing, owes a great deal to the work and influence of Swiss linguist Saussure, who was born in Geneva in 1857 and did much of his work in Paris and died in 1913. He is known as the father of modern linguistics. For our purposes, his importance lies not in his detailed work in linguistics, but in his general view of representation and the way his model of language shaped the semiotic approach to the problem of representation in a wide variety of cultural fields. You will recognize much about Saussure's thinking from what we have already said about the constructionist approach. For Saussure, according to Jonathan Culler, the production of meaning depends on language. Language is a system of signs. Sounds, images, written words, paintings, photographs, etc. function as signs within language only when they serve to express or communicate ideas. To communicate ideas, they must be a part of a system of conventions. Material objects can function as signs and communicate meaning too, as we saw from the language of traffic lights example. In an important move, Saussure analyzed the sign into two further elements. There was, he argued, the form, the actual word, image, photo, etc., and there was the idea or concept in your head with which the form was associated. Saussure called the first element the signifier and the second element the corresponding concept it triggered off in your head, the signified. Every time you hear or read or see the signifier, the word or image of, like, say, a Walkman, for example, it correlates with the signified, the concept of a portable cassette player in your head. Both are required to produce meaning, but it is the relation between them, fixed by our cultural and linguistic codes, which sustains representation. Thus, the sign is the union of a form which signifies, signifier, and an idea, signified, through, though we may speak as if they are separate entities, they exist only as components of the sign, which is the central fact of language. Saussure also insisted on what in section 1 we called the arbitrary nature of the sign. There is no natural or inevitable link between the signifier and the signified. Signs do not possess a fixed or essential meaning. What signifies, according to Saussure, is not red or the essence of redness, but the difference between red and green. Signs, Saussure argued, are members of a system and are defined in relation to the other members of that system. For example, it is hard to define the meaning of father except in relation to and in terms of its different form, other kinship terms like mother, daughter, son, and so on. This marking of difference within language is fundamental to the production of meaning, according to Saussure. Even at a simple level, to repeat an earlier example, we must be able to distinguish within language between sheep and sheet, before we can link one of those words to the concept of an animal that produces wool and the other to the concept of a cloth that covers a bed. The simplest way of making difference is, of course, by means of binary opposition. In this example, all the letters of the exact same P and T. Similarly, the meaning of a concept or word is often defined in relation to its direct opposite, as in day or night. Later critics of Saussure were to observe that binaries, black and white, are only one, rather simplistic way of establishing difference. As well as the stark difference between black and white, there is also many other subtler differences between black and dark gray and light gray and cream, off-white and cream, off-white and brilliant whites, just as there are between night, dawn, daylight, noon, and dusk. However, this attention to binary oppositions brought Saussure to the revolutionary proposition that a language consists of signifiers, but in order to produce meaning, the signifiers have to be organized into a system of differences. It is the difference between signifiers which signify. Furthermore, the relation between the signifier and the signified, which is fixed by our cultural codes, is not, Saussure argued, permanently fixed. Words shift their meanings. The concepts, signifieds, to which they refer also change historically, and every shift alters the conceptual map of the culture, leading different cultures at different historical moments to classify and think about the world differently. For many centuries, Western societies have associated the word black with everything that is dark, evil, foreboding, devilish, dangerous, and sinful. And yet, think of how the perception of black people in America in the 1960s changed after the phrase "black is beautiful" became a popular slogan, where the signifier, black, was made to signify the exact opposite meaning signified to its previous associations. In Saussure's terms, language sets up an arbitrary relation between signifiers of its own choosing on the one hand and signifieds of its own choosing on the other. Not only does each language produce a different set of signifiers, articulating and dividing the continuum of sound, or writing or drawing or photography in a distinctive way, each language produces a different set of signifieds. It has the distinctive and thus arbitrary way of organizing the world into concepts and categories. Color, 1976, page 23. The implications of this argument are very far-reaching for a theory of representation and for our understanding of culture. If the relationship between a signifier and its signified is the result of a system of social conventions specific to each society and to specific historical moments, then all meanings are produced within history and culture. They can never be finally fixed, but are always subject to change, both from one cultural context and from one period to another. There is thus no single, unchanging universal true meaning, because it is arbitrary. The sign is totally subject to history, and the combination at that particular moment of a given signifier and signified is a contingent result of the historical process. Color, 1976, page 36. This opens up meaning and representation in a radical way to history and change. It is true that Saussure himself focused exclusively on the state of the language system at one moment of time rather than looking at linguistic change over time. However, for our purposes, the important point is the way this approach to language unfixes meaning, breaking any natural and inevitable tie between signifier and signified. This opens representation to the constant play or slippage of meaning, to the constant production of new meanings and new interpretations. However, if meaning changes historically and is never finally fixed, then it follows that taking the meaning must involve an active process of interpretation. Meaning has to be actively read or interpreted. Consequently, there is a necessary and inevitable impression about imprecision. There is a necessary and inevitable imprecision about language. The meaning we take as viewers, readers, or audiences is never exactly the meaning which has been given by the speaker or writer or by other viewers. And since in order to say something meaningful, we have to enter language, where all sorts of older meanings, such as where all sorts of older meanings which predate us are already stored from previous eras, we can never cleanse language completely, screening out all the other hidden meanings which might modify or distort what we want to say. For example, we can't entirely prevent some of the negative connotations of the word black from returning to mind when we read the headline like Wednesday, a black day on the stock exchange, even if this was not intended. There is a constant sliding of meaning in all interpretation, a margin, something in excess of what we intended to say, in which other meanings overshadow the statement or the text, where other associations are awakened to life, giving what we say a different twist. So interpretation becomes an essential aspect of the process by which meaning is given and taken. The reader is as important as the writer in the production of meaning. Every signifier, given or coded with meaning, has the meaningfully interpreted or decoded. Every signifier given or encoded with meaning has to be meaningfully interpreted or decoded by the receiver. Hall, 1980. Signs which have not been intelligibly received and interpreted are not, in any useful sense, meaningful. Source divided language into two parts. The first consisted of the general rules and codes of the linguistic system, which all its users must share, if it is to be of use as a means of communication. The rules are the principles which we learn when we learn a language, and they enable us to use language to say whatever we want. For example, in English, the preferred word order is subject, verb, object. The cat sat on the mat, whereas in Latin, the verb usually comes at the end. Saussure called this underlying rule governed structure of language, which enables us to produce well-formed sentences, the language, or the langue, the langue, or the langueur, the langueur, the language system in brackets. The second part consisted of the particular acts of speaking or writing or drawing, which, using the structure and rules of the language, are produced by an actual speaker or writer. He called this parole. La langue or langue is the system of language, the language as a system of forms, whereas parole is actual speech or writing, the speech acts which are made possible by the language. For Saussure, the underlying structure of rules and codes, langue, was the social part of the language, the part which could be studied with the law-like precision of a science because of its closed, limited nature. It was his preference for studying language at this level of its deep structure, which made people call Saussure and his model of language structuralist. The second part of language, the individual speech act or utterance, parole, he regarded as the surface of the language, or the surface of language. There were an infinite number of such possible utterances. Hence, parole inevitably lacked those structural properties forming a closed and limited set, which would have enabled us to study it scientifically. What made Saussure's model appeal to many later scholars was the fact that the closed, structured character of language, at the level of its rules and laws, which according to Saussure enabled it to be studied scientifically, was combined with the capacity to be free and unpredictably creative in our actual speech acts. They believed that he had offered them at least a scientific approach to the least scientific object of inquiry, culture. In separating the social part of language, langue, from the individual act of communication, parole, Saussure broke with our common sense notion of how language works. Our common sense intuition is that language comes from within us, from the individual speaker or writer, that it is this speaking or writing subject who is the author or originator of meaning. This is what we called earlier the intentional model of representation. But according to Saussure's schema, each authored statement only becomes possible because the author shares with other language users the common rules and codes of the language system, the lingua, which allows them to communicate with each other meaningfully. The author decides what she wants to say, but she cannot decide whether or not to use the rules of language if she wants to be understood. We are born into a language, its codes and its meanings. Language is therefore, for Saussure, a social phenomenon. It cannot be an individual matter because we cannot make up the rules of language individually for ourselves. Their source lies in society, in the culture, in our shared cultural codes, in the language system, not in nature or in the individual subject. We will move on in section 3 to consider how the constructionist approach to representation, and in particular Saussure's linguistic model, was applied to a wider set of cultural objects and practices, and evolved into the semiotic, I hate traffic noises, sorry, and evolved into the semiotic method which so influenced the field. First, we ought to take account of some of the criticisms leveled at his position. Sauce's great achievement was to force us to focus on language itself as a social fact, on the process of representation itself, on how language actually works, and the role it plays in the production of meaning. In doing so, he saved language from the status of a mere transparent medium between things and meaning. He showed instead that representation was a practice. However, in his own work, he tended to focus almost exclusively on the two aspects of the sign, signifier and signified. He gave little or no attention to how this relation between signifier, signified, could serve the purpose of what earlier we called reference, i.e., referring to what the world of things, people, and events outside language in the real world. Later linguists made a distinction between, say, the meaning of the word book and the use of the word to refer to a specific book lying before us on the table. The linguist, Charles Sanders Peirce, whilst adopting a similar approach to Sauce, paid greater attention to the relationship between signifiers and signifieds and what he referred there and what he called their referents. What Sauce called signification really involves both meaning and reference, but he focused mainly on the former. Another problem is that Sauce tended to focus on the formal aspects of language, how language actually works. This has the great advantage of making us examine representation as a practice worthy of detailed study in its own right. It forces us to look at language for itself, and not just as an empty, transparent window on the world. However, Sauce's focus on language may have been too exclusive. The attention to its formal aspects did divert attention away from the more interactive and dialogic features of language. Language as it is actually used, as it functions in actual situations, in dialogue between different kinds of speakers. It is thus not surprising that for Sauce, questions of power in language, for example between speakers of different status and positions, did not arise. As has often been the case, the scientific dream which lay behind the structuralist impulse of his work, though influential in altering us, in alerting us to certain aspects of how language works, proved to be illusory. Language is not an object which can be studied with the law-like precision of a science. Later cultural theorists learned from Saussure's structuralism but abandoned its scientific premise. Language remains rule-governed, but it is not a closed system which can be reduced to its formal elements. Since it is constantly changing, it is by definition open-minded, meaning continues to be produced through language in forms which can never be predicted beforehand, and its sliding, as we described above, cannot be halted. Saussure may have been tempted to the former view because, like a good structuralist, he tended to study the state of the language system at one moment, as if it had stood still, and he could halt the flow of language change. Nevertheless, it is the case that many of those who have been the most influenced by Saussure's radical break with all reflective and intentional modes of representation have built on his work, not by imitating his scientific and structuralist approach, but by applying his model in a much looser, more open-minded, i.e. post-structuralist way. How far, then, have we come in our discussion of theories of representation? We began by contrasting three different approaches. The reflective or mimetic approach proposed a direct and transparent relationship of an imitation or reflection between worlds, signs, and things. The intentional theory reduced representation to the intentions of its author or subject. The constructionist theory proposed a complex and mediated relationship between things in the world, our concepts in thought and language. We have focused at greatest length on this approach. The correlations between these levels, the material, the conceptual, and the signifying, are governed by our cultural and linguistic codes, and it is this set of interconnections which produces meaning. When we showed how much this general model of how systems of representation work in the production of meaning owed to the work of Ferdinand de Saussure. Here, the key point was the link provided by the codes between the forms of expression used by language, whether speech, writing, drawing, or other types of representation, which Saussure called the signifiers, and the mental concepts associated with them, the signifieds. The connection between these two systems of representation produced signs, and signs, organized into languages, produced meanings and could be used to reference objects, people, and events in the real world. Saussure's main contribution was to the study of linguistics in a narrow sense. However, since his death, his theories have been widely deployed as a foundation for a general approach to language and meaning, providing a model of representation which has been applied to a wide range of cultural objects and practices. Saussure himself foresaw this possibility in his famous lecture notes collected posthumously by his students as the Course in General Linguistics 1960, where he looked forward to a science that studies the life of signs within society. I shall call it semiology, from the Greek word semeion, signs. This general approach to the study of signs in culture and of culture as a sort of language, which Saussure's foreshadowed, is now generally known by the term semiotics. The underlying argument behind the semiotic approach is that since all cultural objects convey meaning and all cultural practices depend on meaning, they must make sense. I think make use of signs. Sorry, the text doesn't have a word, it's a word missing. They must make use of signs, and insofar as they do, they must work like language works, and must be amenable to an analysis which basically makes use of Saussure's linguistic concepts. For example, the signifier, signified, and the langue, parole, distinctions, his idea of underlying codes and structures, and the arbitrary nature of the sign. Thus, when in his collection of essays, Mythologies, the French critic Roland Barthes studied the world of wrestling, soap, powders, and detergents, the face of Greta Garbo, the blue guides to Europe. He brought a semiotic approach to bear on reading popular culture, treating the activities and objects as signs, as language through which the meaning is communicated. For example, most of us would think of a wrestling match as a competitive game or sport designed for one wrestler to gain victory over an opponent. Barthes, however, asks not who won, but what is the meaning of the event. He treats it as a text to be read. He reads the exaggerated gestures of wrestlers as a grandiloquent language of what he calls the pure spectacle of excess. You should now read the brief extract from the Barthes reading of The World of Wrestling, provided as a reading B at the end of this chapter. Interesting. In much the same way, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss studied the customs, rituals, totemic objects, designs, myths, and folk tales of so-called primitive peoples in Brazil, not by analyzing how these things were produced and used in the context of daily life amongst the Amazonian peoples, but in terms of what they were trying to say, what messages about the culture they communicated. He analyzed their meaning, not by interpreting their content, but by looking at the underlying rules and codes through which such objects or practices produced meaning, and in doing so, he was making a classic Saussurian or structuralist move from the paroles of a culture to the underlying structure, its lingua. To undertake this kind of work in studying the meaning of a television program like EastEnders, for example, we would have to treat the pictures on the screen as signifiers and use the code of the television soap opera as a genre to discover how each image on the screen made use of rules to say something, signifieds, which the viewer could read or interpret within the formal framework of a popular kind of television narrative. See the discussion and analysis of TV soap operas in Chapter 6. In the semiotic approach, not only works and images, but objects themselves can function as signifiers in the production of meaning. Clothes, for example, may have a simple physical function to cover the body and protect it from the weather. But clothes also double up as signs. They construct a meaning and carrying a message. An evening dress may signify elegance, a bow tie and tails, formality. Jeans and trainers, casual dress, a certain kind of sweater in the right setting, a long romantic autumn walk in the wood. These signs enable clothes to convey meaning and to function like a language, the language of fashion. How do they do this? Look at the example of clothes in a magazine fashion spread. Apply Source's model to analyze what the clothes are saying. How could you describe their message? How could you decode their message? In particular, which elements are operating as signifiers and what concepts, signifieds, are you applying to them? Don't just get an overall impression, work it out in detail. How is the language of fashion working in this example? The clothes themselves are the signifiers. The fashion code in Western consumer cultures, like ours, correlates particular kinds of combinations of clothing with certain concepts: elegance, formality, casualness, romance. These are the signifiers. This coding converts the clothes into signs, which can then be read as language. In the language of fashion, the signifiers are arranged in a certain sequence, in certain relations to one another. Relations may be of similarity. Certain items go together, e.g. casual shoes with jeans. Differences are also marked. No leather belts with evening wear. Some signs actually create meaning by exploiting difference. Doc Marten boots with a flowing long skirt. These bits of clothing say something. They convey meaning. Of course, not everybody reads fashion in the same way. There are differences of gender, age, class, and race. But all those who share the same fashion code will interpret the signs in roughly the same ways. Oh, jeans don't look right for that event. It's a formal occasion. It demands something more elegant. You may have noticed that, in this example, we have moved away from the very narrow linguistic level from which we drew examples in the first section, to a wider cultural level. Note also that two linked operations are required to complete the representation processes by which meaning is produced. First, we need a basic code which links a particular piece of material which is cut and sewn in a particular way, signifier, to our mental concept of it, signified. Say a particular cut of material to our concept of a dress or jeans. Remember that only some cultures would read the signifier in this way, or indeed possess the concept of it, i.e. have classified clothes into a dress as different from jeans. The combination of a signifier and signified is what Sauce called a sign. Then, having recognized the material as a dress or as jeans and produced a sign, we can progress to a second, wider level, which links these signs to broader cultural themes, concepts, or meanings. For example, an evening dress to formality or elegance, jeans to casualness. Barthes called the first descriptive level the level of denotation, the second level that of connotation. Both, of course, require the use of codes. Denotation is the simple, basic descriptive level where consensus is wide and most people would agree on the meaning: dress, jeans. At the second level, connotation, these signifiers which we have been able to decode at a simple level by using our conventional conceptual signifiers of dress to read their meaning, enter a wider second kind of code, the language of fashion, which connects them to broader themes and meanings, linking them with what we may call the wider semantic fields of our culture, ideas of elegance, formality, casualness, and romance. The second wider meaning is no longer a descriptive level of obvious interpretation. Here we are beginning to interpret the completed signs in terms of the wider realms of social ideology, the general beliefs, conceptual frameworks, and value systems of society. The second level of signification Barth suggests is more general, global, and diffuse. It deals with fragments of an ideology. These signifieds have a very close communication with culture, knowledge, history, and it is through them, so to speak, that the environmental world of culture invades the system of representation. In his essay, Myth Today,
No need to apologize.
No, Siri? In his essay, Myth Today, in Mythologies, Barthes gives another example which helps us to see exactly how representation is working at the second, broader cultural level. Visiting the Barbers one day, Barthes is shown a copy of the French magazine Paris Match, which has on its cover a picture of a young black person. Oh my god, I cannot believe they used... Wow, crazy. This is, I think, this is 1997 onwards. Crazy. Of a young black person in a French uniform saluting with his eyes uplifted, probably fixed on the fold of the tricolour, the French flag. At the first level, to get any meaning at all, we need to decode each of the signifiers in the image into their appropriate concepts. A soldier, a uniform, an arm raised, eyes lifted, and a French flag. This yields a set of signs with a simple, literal message or meaning. A black soldier is giving the French flag a salute, denotation. However, Barthes argues that this image also has a wider cultural meaning. If we ask what is Paris Match telling us by using this picture of a black soldier saluting the French flag, Barthes suggests that we may come up with the message that France is a great empire and that all her sons, without any color discrimination, faithfully serve under her flag, and that there is no better answer to the detractors of an alleged colonialism than the zeal shown by this black person in serving his so-called oppressor. Whatever you think of the actual message which Barthes finds, for a proper semiotic analysis, you must be able to outline precisely the different steps by which this broader meaning has been produced. Barthes argues that here representation takes place through two separate but linked processes. In the first, the signifiers, the elements of the image, and the signifieds, the concepts, soldier, flag, and so on, unite to form a sign with a simple denoted message. A black soldier is giving the French flag a salute. At the second stage, this completed message or sign is linked to a second set of signifieds, a broad ideological theme about French colonialism. The first complicated meaning functions as the signifier in the second stage of the representation process, and when linked with a wider theme by a reader, yields a second, more elaborate and ideologically framed message or meaning. Barthes gives this second concept or theme a name. He calls it a purposeful mixture of French imperiality and militariness. This, he says, adds up to a message about French colonialism and her faithful black soldier sons. Barthes calls this second level of signification the level of myth. In this reading, he adds, French imperiality is the very drive behind the myth. The concept reconstitutes a chain of causes and effects, motives and intentions. Through the concept, a whole new history is implanted in the myth of the concept of French imperiality is again tied to the totality of the world, to the general history of France, to its colonial adventures, to its present difficulties. Turn to the short extract from Myth Today, reading C at the end of this chapter, and read Barthes's account of how myth functions as a system of representation. Make sure you understand what Barthes means by two staggered systems and by the idea that a myth is a meta-language, a second-order language. For another example of this two-stage process of signification, we can turn to another of Barthes's famous essays. Look carefully at the advertisement for Panzani products, and with Barthes's analysis in mind, do the following exercise. What signifiers do you identify in this ad? What are their significance? Now look at the ad as a whole. At the level of myth, what is its wider cultural message or theme? Can you construct one? Now read the second extract from Barthes, in which he offers an interpretation of the Panzani ad for spaghetti and vegetables in a string bag as a myth about Italian national culture, the extract from Rhetoric of the Image, in Image Music Text, 1979, which is included in reading D at the end of this chapter. My goodness, there are lots and lots and lots of things. Okay. Barthes suggests that we can read the Panzani ad as a myth by linking its completed message. This is a picture of some packets of pasta, a tin, a sachet, some tomatoes, onions, peppers, a mushroom, all emerging from a half-open string bag, with the cultural theme or concept of Italianicity, or as we would say, Italianness. Then, at the level of the myth or meta-language, the Panzani ad becomes a message about the essential meaning of Italianness as a national culture. Can commodities really become the signifiers for myths of nationality? Can you think of ads in magazines or television which work in the same way, drawing on the myth of Englishness, Frenchness, Americanness, Indianness? Try to apply the idea of Englishness to the ad reproduced in Figure 17. Figure 17 is an ad of Jaguar, the car brand. What the examples above show is that the semiotic approach provides a method for analyzing how visual representations convey meaning. Already in Roland Barthes' work in the 1960s, as we have seen, Saussure's linguistic model is developed through its application to a much wider field of signs and representations: advertising, photography, popular culture, travel, fashion, etc. Also, there is less concern with how individual works function as signs in language, more about the application of the language model to a much broader set of cultural practices. Source held out the promise that the whole domain of meaning could be systematically mapped. Barthes, too, had a method, but his semiotic approach is much more loosely and interpretively applied, and in his later work, for example, The Pleasure of the Text, 1975, he is more concerned with the play of meaning and desire across texts than he is with the attempt to fix meaning by a scientific analysis of language's rules and laws. Subsequently, as we observed, the project of a science of meaning has appeared increasingly unattainable. Meaning and representation seem to belong irrevocably to the interpretive side of human and cultural science, whose subject matter, society, culture, the human subject, is not amenable to a positivistic approach. One which seeks to discover scientific laws about society. Later developments have recognized the necessarily imperative nature of culture and the fact that interpretations never produce a final moment of absolute truth. Instead, interpretations are always followed by other interpretations in an endless chain. As the French philosopher Jacques Derrida put it, writing always leads to more writing. Difference, he argued, can never be wholly captured within any binary system. Derrida, 1981. So any notion of a final meaning is always less endlessly put off, deferred. Cultural studies of this interpretive kind, like other qualitative forms of sociological inquiry, are inevitably caught up in the circle of meaning. In the semiotic approach, representation was understood on the basis of the way words functioned as signs within language. But for a start, in a culture, meaning often depends on larger units of analysis, narratives, statements, groups of images, whole discourses, which operate across a variety of texts, areas of knowledge about a subject which have been acquired widespread authority. Semiotics seemed to confine the process of representation to language and to treat it as a closed, rather static system. Subsequent developments became more concerned with the representation as a source for the production of social knowledge, a more open system connected in more intimate ways with social practices and questions of power. In the semiotic approach, the subject was always displaced from the center of language. Later theorists returned to the question of the subject, or at least to the empty space which Saussure's theory had left, without, of course, putting him or her back in the center as the author or source of meaning. Even in language, in some sense, spoke us, as Saussure tended to argue. It was also important that in certain historical moments, some people had more power to speak about some subjects than others. Male doctors about mad female patients in the late 19th century, for example, to take one of the key examples developed in the work of Michel Foucault. Models of representation, these critics argued, ought to focus on these broader issues of knowledge and power. Foucault used the word representation in a narrower sense than we are using it here, but he is considered to have contributed to a novel and significant general approach to the problem of representation. What concerned him was the production of knowledge rather than just meaning, through what he called discourse rather than just language. His project, he said, was to analyze how human beings understand themselves in our culture and how our knowledge about the social, embodied individual, and shared meanings comes to be produced in different periods. With its emphasis on cultural understanding and shared meanings, you can see that Foucault's project was still to some degree indebted to Saussure's and Barthes's, while in other ways departing radically from them. Foucault's work was much more historically grounded, more attentive to historical specificities than some semiotic approach. As he said, relations of power, not relations of meaning, were his main concern. The particular objects of Foucault's attention were the various disciplines of knowledge in the human and the social sciences, what he called the subjectifying social sciences. These had acquired an increasingly prominent and influential role in modern culture, and were in many instances considered to be the discourses which, like religion in earlier times, could give us the truth about knowledge. We will return to Foucault's work in some of the subsequent chapters in this book. Here, we want to introduce Foucault and the discursive approach to representation by outlining 3 of his major ideas: his concept of discourse, the issue of power and knowledge, and the question of the subject. It might be useful, however, to start by giving you a general flavor in Foucault's graphic and somewhat overstated terms of how he saw his project differing from that of the semiotic approach to representation. He moved away from an approach like that of Saussure's and Barth's based on the domain of signifying a structure, towards one based on analyzing what he called relations of force, strategic developments, and tactics. Here, I believe one's point of reference should not be to the great model of language, lingua, and science, but to that of war and battle, the history of which bears and determines us has the form of a war rather than that of a language, relations of power, not relations of meaning. Rejecting both Hegelian Marxism, what he calls the dialectic, and semiotics, Foucault argued that neither the dialectic as logic of contradictions, nor semiotics as the structure of communication can account for the intrinsic intelligibility of conflicts. Dialectic is a way of evading the always open and hazardous reality of conflict by reducing it to a Hegelian skeleton, and semiology is a way of avoiding its violent, bloody, and lethal character by reducing it to the calm Platonic form of language and dialogue. The first point to note, then, is the shift of attention in Foucault from language to discourse. He studied not language, but discourse as a system of representation. Normally, the term discourse is used as a linguistic concept. It simply means passages of connected writing or speech. Michael Foucault, however, gave it a different meaning. What interested him were the rules and practices that produced meaningful statements and regulated discourse in different historical periods. By discourse, Foucault meant a group of statements which provide a language for talking about, a way of representing the knowledge about a particular topic at a particular historical moment. Discourse is about the production of knowledge through language. But since all social practices entail meaning, and meanings shape and influence what we do, our conduct, all practices have a discursive aspect. It is important to note that the concept of discourse in this usage is not purely a linguistic concept. It is about language and practice. It attempts to overcome the traditional distinction between what one says, language, and what one does, practice. Discourse, Foucault argues, constructs the topic. It defines and produces the objects of our knowledge. It governs the way that a topic can be meaningfully talked about and reasoned about. It also influences how ideas are put into practice and used to regulate the conduct of others. Just as a discourse rules in certain ways of talking about a topic, defining an acceptable, intelligible way to talk, write, or conduct oneself, so also by definition, it rules out, limits, and restricts other ways of talking, of conducting ourselves in relation to the topic or constructing knowledge about it. Discourse, Foucault argued, never consists of one statement, one text, one action, one source. The same discourse, characteristic of the way of thinking or the state of knowledge at any one time, what Foucault called the episteme. Episteme will appear across a range of texts and as forms of conduct at a number of different institutional sites within society. However, whenever these discursive events refer to the same object, share the same style, and support a strategy of common institutional, administrative, or political drift and pattern, they are said by Foucault to belong to the same discursive formation. Meaning and meaningful practice is therefore constructed within discourse, like the semioticians. Foucault was a constructionist. However, unlike them, he was concerned with the production of knowledge and meaning, not through language but through discourse. There were therefore similarities but also substantive differences between these two versions. The idea that discourse produces the object of knowledge and that nothing which is meaningful exists outside discourse is at first sight a disconcerting proposition which seems to run right against the grain of common sense thinking. It is worth spending a moment to explore this idea further. Is Foucault saying, as some of his critics have charged, that nothing exists outside of discourse? In fact, Foucault does not deny that things can have a real material existence in the world. What he does argue is that nothing has any meaning outside of discourse. As Laclau and Moffat put it, we use the term discourse to emphasize the fact that every social configuration is meaningful. The concept of discourse is not about whether things exist, but about where meaning comes from. Turn now to reading E. Goodness gracious, this man loves to pack reading in. Turn now to Reading E by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, a short extract from New Reflections on the Revolution of Our Time, from which we have just quoted, and read it carefully. What they argue is that physical objects do exist, but they have no fixed meaning. They only take on meaning and become objects of knowledge within discourse. Make sure you follow their argument before reading further. We're not going to do that. 1. In terms of the discourse about building a wall, the distinction between the linguistic part, asking for a brick, and the physical act of putting the brick in place does not matter. The first linguistic, the second is physical. Both are discursive, meaningful within discourse. 2. The round leather object which you kick is a physical object, a ball. But it only becomes a football within the context of the rules of the game, which are socially constructed. 3. It is impossible to determine the meaning of an object outside of its context use. A stone thrown in a fight is a different thing, a projectile, from a stone displayed in a museum, a piece of sculpture. This idea that physical things and actions exist, This idea that physical things and actions exist, but they only take on meaning and become objects of knowledge within discourse, is at the heart of the constructionist theory of meaning and representation. Foucault argues that since we can only have a knowledge of things if they have a meaning, it is discourse, not the things in themselves, which produces knowledge. Subjects like madness, punishment, and sexuality only exist meaningfully within the discourses about them. Thus, the study of the discourses of madness, punishment, or sexuality would have to include the following elements. 1. Statements about madness, punishment, or sexuality, which give us a certain kind of knowledge about these things. 2. The rules which we prescribe certain ways of talking about these topics and exclude other ways, which govern what is sayable or thinkable about insanity, punishment, or sexuality at a particular historic moment. 3. Subjects, whom in some ways personify the discourse, the madman, the hysterical woman, the criminal, the deviant, the sexual perverse person, with the attributes we would expect these subjects to have, given the way knowledge about the topic was constructed at the time. How this knowledge about the topic acquires authority. 4. How this knowledge about the topic acquires authority, a sense of embodying the truth about it, constituting the truth of the matter at a historical moment. 5. The practices within institutions for dealing with the subjects, medical treatment for the insane, punishment regimes for the guilty, moral discipline for the sexually deviant, whose conduct is being regulated and organized according to those ideas. Acknowledgement that a different discourse or episteme will arise at a later historical moment, supplanting the existing one, opening up a new discoursive formation and producing in its turn new conceptions of madness or punishment or sexuality, new discourses with the power and authority, the truth, to regulate social practices in new ways. The main point to get hold of here is the way discourse, representation, knowledge, and truth are radically historicized by Foucault, in contrast to the rather ahistorical tendency in semiotics. Things meant something and were true, he argued, only within a specific historical context. Foucault did not believe that the same phenomena would be found across different historical periods. He thought, in each period, discourse produced forms of knowledge, objects, subjects, and practices of knowledge, which differed radically from period to period, with no necessary continuity between them. Thus, for Foucault, for example, mental illness was not an objective fact which remained the same in all historic periods and meant the same thing in all cultures. It was only within a definite discursive formation that the object madness could appear at all as a meaningful or intelligible construct. It was constituted by all that was said in all the statements that named it, divided it up, described it, expanded it, traced it, its development, indicated its various correlations, judged it, and possibly gave it speech by articulating in its name discourses that were to be taken as its own. 1972, page 32. And it was only after a certain definition of madness was put into practice that the appropriate subject, the madman, as current medical and psychiatric knowledge defined him, could appear. Or take some other examples of discursive practices from his work. There have always been sexual relations, but sexuality as a specific way of talking about, studying, and regulating sexual desire, its secrets and its fantasies, Foucault argued, only appeared in Western societies at a particular historical moment. There may always have been what we now call homosexual forms of behavior, but the homosexual as a specific kind of social subject was produced and could only make its appearance within the moral, legal, medical, psychiatric discourses, practices, and institutional apparatuses of the late 19th century, with their particular theories of sexual perversity, Weeks 1981 and 1985. Similarly, it makes nonsense to talk of the hysterical woman outside of the 19th century view of hysteria as a very widespread female malady. Malady. In The Birth of the Clinic, 1973, Foucault charted how in less than half a century the medical understanding of disease was transformed from a classical notion that disease existed separate from the body to the modern idea that disease arose from within and could be mapped directly by its cause through the human body. This discursive shift changed medical practice. It gave greater importance to the doctor's gaze, which could now read the course of the disease simply by a powerful look at what Foucault called the visible body of the patient, following the routes laid down in accordance with the now familiar geometry, the anatomical atlas. This greater knowledge increased the doctor's power of surveillance vis-a-vis the patient. Knowledge about the practices around all these subjects, Foucault argued, were historically and culturally specific. They did not and could not meaningfully exist outside specific discourses, i.e. outside the ways they were represented in discourse, produced in knowledge and regulated by the discursive practices and disciplinary techniques of a particular society and time. Far from accepting the trans-historical continuities of which historians are so fond, Foucault believed that more significant were the radical breaks, ruptures, and discontinuities between one period and another, between one discursive formation and another. In his later work, Foucault became even more concerned with how knowledge was put to work through discursive practices in scientific institutional settings to regulate the conduct of others. He focused on the relationship between knowledge and power, and how power operated within what he called an institutional apparatus and its techniques. Foucault's conception of the apparatus of punishment, for example, included a variety of diverse elements, linguistic and non-linguistic discourses, institutions, architectural arrangements, regulations, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical propositions, morality, philanthropy, etc. The apparatus is thus always inscribed in a play of power, but it is also always linked to a certain coordinates of knowledge. This is what the apparatus consists in: strategies of relations of forces supporting and supported by the types of knowledge. Foucault, 1980, pp. 194 to 196. This approach took as one of its key subjects and of investigation the relations between knowledge, power, and the body in modern society. It saw knowledge as always inextricably enmeshed in relations of power because it was always being applied to the regulation of social conduct and practice, for example, to particular bodies. This foregrounding of the relation between discourse, knowledge, and power marked a significant development in the constructionist approach to representation, which we have been outlining. It rescued representation from the clutches of a purely formal theory and gave it a historical, practical, and worldly context of operation. You may wonder to what extent this concern with discourse, knowledge, and power brought Foucault's interests closer to those of the classical sociological theories of ideology, especially Marxism, with its concern to identify the class positions and class interests concealed within particular forms of knowledge. Foucault, indeed, does come closer to addressing some of these questions about ideology than perhaps formal semiotics did, though Roland Barthes was also concerned with the questions of ideology and myth, as we saw earlier. But Foucault had quite specific and cogent reasons why he rejected the classical Marxist problematic of ideology. Marx had argued that in every epoch, ideas reflect the economic basis of society, and thus the ruling ideas are those of the ruling class, which governs a capitalist economy and correspond to its dominant interests. Foucault's main argument against the classical Marxist theory of ideology was that it tended to reduce all the relation between knowledge and power to a question of class, power, and class interests. Foucault did not deny the existence of classes, but he was strongly opposed to this powerful element of economic or class reductionism in the Marxist theory of ideology. Secondly, he argued that Marxism tended to contrast the distortions of bourgeois knowledge against its own claims of truth Marxist science. But Foucault did not believe that any form of thought could claim an absolute truth of this kind outside the play of discourse. All political and social forms of thought, he believed, were inevitably caught up in the interplay of knowledge and power. So his work rejects the traditional Marxist question, in whose class interests does language, representation, and power operate. Later theorists, like the Italian Antonio Gramsci, who was influenced by Marx but rejected class reductionism, advanced a definition of ideology which is considerably closer to Foucault's position, though still too preoccupied with class questions to be acceptable to him. Gramsci's notion was that particular social groups struggle in many different ways, including ideologically, to win the consent of other groups and achieve a kind of ascendancy in both thought and practice over them. This form of power, Gramsci called hegemony. Hegemony is never permanent and is not reducible to economic interests or to a simple class model of society. This has some similarities to Foucault's position, though on some key issues they differ radically. The question of hegemony hegemony. Hegemony. Hegemony is briefly addressed again in chapter 4. What is distinguished Foucault's position on discourse, knowledge, and power from the Marxist theory of class interests and ideological distortion? Well, Foucault advanced at least two radically novel propositions: knowledge, power, and truth. The first concerns the way Foucault conceived the linkage between knowledge and power. Hitherto, we have tended to think that power operates in a direct and brutally repressive fashion, dispensing with polite things like culture and knowledge, though Gramsci certainly broke with that model of power. Foucault argued that not only is knowledge always a form of power, but power is implicated in the questions of whether and in what circumstances knowledge is to be applied or not. This question of the application and effectiveness of knowledge and power was more important, he thought, than the question of its truth. Knowledge is linked to power, not only assumes the authority of the truth, but has the power to make itself true. All knowledge, once applied in the real world, has real effects, and, in that sense at least, becomes true. Knowledge, once used to regulate and conduct the conduct of others, entails constraint, regulation, and the disciplining of practices. Thus, there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. According to Foucault, what we think we know in a particular period about, say, crime, has a bearing on how we regulate, control, and punish criminals. Knowledge does not operate in a void. It is put to work through certain technologies and strategies of application in specific situations, historical contexts, and institutional regimes. To study punishment, you must study how the combination of discourse and power, knowledge, has produced a certain conception of crime, and the criminal has had certain real effects both for criminal and for the punisher, and how these have been set into practice in certain historically specific prison regimes. This led Foucault to speak not of the truth of knowledge in the absolute sense, a truth which remained so, whatever period, setting, context, but of a discursive formation sustaining a regime of truth. Thus, it may or may not be true that single parenting inevitably leads to delinquency and crime, but if everyone believes it to be so and punishes single parents accordingly, this will have real consequences for both parents and children and will become true in terms of its real effects, even if in some absolute sense it has never been conclusively proven. In the human and social sciences, Foucault argued, truth isn't outside power. Truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effects of power. Each society has its own regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. 2. Conceptions of power. Secondly, Foucault advanced an altogether novel conception of power. We tend to think of power as always radiating in a single direction, from top to bottom, and coming from a specific source, the sovereign, the state, the ruling class, so on. For Foucault, however, power does not function in the form of a chain. It circulates. It is never monopolized by one center. It is deployed and exercised through a net-like organization. This suggests that we are all, to some degree, caught up in its circulation, oppressors and oppressed. It does not radiate downwards, either from one source or one place, Power relations permeate all levels of social existence and are therefore to be found operating at every site of social life, in the private spheres of the family and sexuality as much as in the public spheres of politics, economy, and law. What's more, power is not only negative, representing what it seeks to control, it is also productive. It doesn't only weigh on us as a force that says no, but it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure. It forms knowledge. It produces discourse. It needs to be thought of as a productive network which runs through the whole social body. The punishment system, for example, produces books, treaties, regulations, new strategies of control and resistance, debates in parliament, conversations, confessions, legal briefs and appeals, training regimes for prison officers, and so on. The efforts to control sexuality produce a very veritable explosion of discourse. Talk about sex, television and radio programs, sermons and legislation, novels, stories and magazine features, medical and counseling advice, essays and articles, learned thesis and research programs, as well as new sexual practices, for example, safe sex and the pornography industry, without denying that the state, the law, the sovereign, or the dominant class may have positions of dominance, Foucault shifts our attention away from the grand overall strategies of power towards the many localized circuits, tactics, mechanisms, and effects through which power circulates, what Foucault calls the meticulous rituals or the microphysics of power. These power relations go right down to the depth of society. They connect the way power is actually working on the ground to the great pyramids of power by what he calls a capillary movement. Capillaries being thin-walled vessels that aid the exchange of... A capillary is a thin-walled vessel that aids the exchange of oxygen between the blood in our bodies and the surrounding tissues. Not because power at these levels merely reflects or reproduces at the level of individuals, bodies, gestures, and behavior, the general form of the law or government, Foucault, 1977, but on the contrary, because such an approach roots power in forms of behavior, bodies, and local relations of power, which should not at all be seen as a simple projection of the central power. To what object are the microphysics of power primarily applied in Foucault's model? To the body. He places the body at the center of the struggles between different formations of power and knowledge. The techniques of regulation are applied to the body. Different discursive formations and apparatuses divide, classify, and inscribe the body differently in their respective regimes of power and truth. In Discipline and Punish, for example, Foucault analyzes the very different ways in which the body of the criminal is produced and displayed in different punishment regimes in France. In earlier periods, punishment was haphazard. Prisons were places into which the public could wander, and the ultimate punishment was inscribed violently on the body by means of instruments of torture and execution, etc. A practice, the essence of which is that it should be the public, visible to everyone. The modern form of disciplinary regulation and power, by contrast, is private, individualized. Prisoners are shut away from the public and are often shut away from one another, though continually under surveillance from the authorities, and punishment is individualized. Here, the body has become the site of a new kind of disciplinary regime. Of course, this body is not simply the natural body with which all human beings possess at all times. This body is produced within discourse, according to the different discursive formations. The state of knowledge about crime and the criminal, what counts as true about how to change or deter criminal behavior, the specific apparatus and technologies of punishment prevailing at the time, This is a radically historicized conception of the body, a sort of surface on which different regimes of power, knowledge, write their meanings and effects. It thinks of the body as totally imprinted by history and the processes of history's deconstruction of the body. Foucault's approach to representation is not easy to summarize. He is concerned with the production of knowledge and meaning through discourse. Foucault does indeed analyze particular texts and representations, and the semioticians did. But he is more inclined to analyze the whole discursive formation to which a text or practice belongs. His concern is with the knowledge provided by the human and social sciences, which organizes conduct, understanding, practice, and belief, the regulation of bodies as well as whole populations. Although his work is clearly done in the wake of and profoundly influenced by the turn to language which marked the constructionist approach to representation, his definition of discourse is much broader than language and includes many other elements of practice and institutional regulation which the sources approach, with its linguistic focus, excluded. Foucault is always much more historically specific, seeing forms of power and knowledge as always rooted in particular contexts and histories. Above all, for Foucault, the production of knowledge is always crossed with questions of power and the body, and this greatly expands the scope of what is involved in representation. The major critique leveled against his work is that he tends to absorb too much into discourse, and that this has the effect of encouraging his followers to neglect the influence of the material, economic, and structural forces in the operation of power and knowledge. Some critics also find his rejection of any criterion of truth in the human sciences in favor of the idea of a regime of truth a regime of truth, and the will to power, the will to make things true, vulnerable to the charge of relativism. Nevertheless, there is little doubt about the major impact which his work has had on contemporary theories of representation and meaning. In the following example, we will try to apply Foucault's method to a particular example. Figure 1.8 shows a painting of André Boulot, I do not know if I'm saying that name correctly, of the famous French psychiatrist and neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, lecturing on the subject of female hysteria to students in the lecture theatre of his famous Parisian clinic at La Salpêtrière. Right. When we look at this painting, what does it reveal as a representation of the study of hysteria? Brulé shows a hysterical patient being supported by an assistant and attended by two women. For many years, hysteria has been traditionally identified as a female malady, I think as a female disease, and although Charcot demonstrated conclusively that many historical symptoms were to be found in men, and a significant proportion of his patients were diagnosed male hysterics, Elaine Showalter observes that for Charcot, too, hysteria remains symbolically, if not medically, a female malady. Don't know, never seen malady be used in place of mental disorder before, but I understand it as being a female mental disorder or mental illness. Charcot was a very humane man who took his patients' suffering seriously and treated them with dignity. He diagnosed hysteria and as a genuine ailment rather than a malingerer's excuse, much as has happened in our time after many struggles with other illnesses like anorexia and ME. This painting represents a regular feature of Charcot's treatment regime, where hysterical female patients are displayed before an audience of medical staff and students, the symptoms of their malady ending often with a full hysterical seizure. The painting could be said to capture and represent visually a discursive event, the emergence of a new regime of knowledge. Charcot's great distinction, which drew students from far and wide to study with him, including in 1885 the young Sigmund Freud from Vienna, was his demonstration that hysterical symptoms such as paralysis could be produced and relived by hypnotic suggestion. Here we see the practice of hypnosis being applied in practice. Indeed, the image seems to capture two such moments of knowledge production. Charcot did not pay much attention to what the patients said, though he observed their actions and gestures meticulously, but Freud and his friend Breuer did. At first, in their work, when they went home, they used Charcot's hypnosis method, which had attracted such wide attention as a novel approach to treatment of hysteria at La Salpêtrière. But some years later, they treated a young woman called Bertha Poppenheim for hysteria, and she, under the pseudonym Anna O., became the first case study written up in Freud and Breuer's path-breaking studies in hysteria. It was the loss of words, her failing grasp of the syntax of her own language, German, the silences and meaningless babble of this brilliantly intellectual, poetic, and imaginative but rebellious woman, which gave Breuer and Freud the first clue that her linguistic disturbance was related to her resentment at her place as dutiful daughter of a decidedly patriarchal father, and thus deeply connected with her illness. After hypnosis, her capacity to speak coherently returned, and she spoke fluently in 3 other languages, though not in her native German. Through her dialogue with Breuer and her ability to work through her difficult relationship in relation to language, Anna O gave the first example of the talking cure, which, of course, then provided the whole basis for Freud's subsequent development of the psychoanalytic method. So, we are looking, in this image, at the birth of 2 new psychiatric epistemes, Charcot's method of hypnosis and the conditions which later produced psychoanalysis. The example also has many connections with the question of representation. In the picture, the patient is performing or representing with her body the hysterical symptoms from which she is suffering, but these symptoms are also being represented in the way very different medical language of diagnosis and analysis to her or his audience by the professor, a relationship which involves power. Showalter notes that, in general, the representation of female hysteria was a central aspect for Charcot's work. Indeed, the clinic was filled with lithographs and paintings. He had his assistants assemble and photograph an album of nervous patients, a sort of visual inventory of the various types of hysterical patient. He later employed a professional photographer to take charge of the service. His analysis of the displayed symptoms, which seems to be what is happening in the painting, accompanied the hysterical performance. He did not flinch from the spectacular and theatrical aspects associated with its demonstrations of hypnosis as a treatment regime. Freud thought that every one of his fascinating lectures was a little work of art in construction and composition. Indeed, Freud noted he never appeared greater to his listeners than after he had made the effort by giving the most detailed account of his train of thought, by the greatest frankness about his doubts and hesitations to reduce the gulf between teacher and pupil. Now look carefully at the picture again, and bearing in mind what we have said about Foucault's method of an approach to representation, answer the following question. Who commands the center of the picture? Who or what is the subject? Are the 1 and the 2 the same? Can you tell that knowledge is being produced here? How? What do you notice about relations of power in the picture? How are they represented? How does the form and spatial relationships of the picture represent this? Describe the double gaze of the people in the image. Who is looking at whom? What does that tell us? What do the age and gender of the participants tell us? What message does the patient's body convey? Is there a sexual meaning in the image? If so, what? What is the relationship of you, the viewer, to the image? Do you notice anything else about the image that you have missed? Now read the account. My goodness, reading F, cool. Lovely, we have A, B, C, D, E, F readings that are not covered in this document, I'm afraid. We have traced the shift in Foucault's work from language to discourse and knowledge, and their relation to questions of power. But where in all this, you might ask, is the subject? Saussure tended to abolish the subject from the question of representation. Language, he argued, speaks to us. The subject appears in Saussure's schema as the author of individual speech acts, paroles. But as we have seen, Saussure did not think that the level of the paroles was one at which a scientific analysis of language could be conducted. In one sense, Foucault shares this opinion. For him, it is discourse, not the subject, which produces knowledge. Discourse is enmeshed with power, but it is not necessary to find a subject, the king, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the state, etc., for power and knowledge to operate. On the other hand, Foucault did include the subject in his theorizing, though he did not restore the subject to its position as the center and author of representation. Indeed, as his work developed, he became more and more concerned with questions about the subject. And in his very late and unfinished work, he even went so far as to give the subject a certain reflexive awareness of his or her own conduct through this still stopped short of restoring the subject to his or her full sovereignty. Foucault was certainly deeply critical of what we might call the traditional conception of the subject. The conventional notion thinks of the subject as an individual who is fully endowed with consciousness, an autonomous and stable entity, the core of the self, and the independent, authentic source of action and meaning. According to this conception, when we hear ourselves speak, we feel we are identical with what has been said. And this identity of the subject with what is gives him or her a privileged position in relation to meaning. It suggests that although other people may misunderstand us, we always understand ourselves because we were the source of meaning in the first place. However, as we have seen, the shift towards a constructionist conception of language and representation did a great deal to displace the subject from a privileged position in relation to knowledge and meaning. The same is true of Foucault's discursive approach. It is discourse, not the subjects who speak it, which produces knowledge. Subjects may produce particular texts, but they are operating within the limits of the episteme, the distinctive formation, the regime of truth, of a particular period and culture. Indeed, this is one of Foucault's most radical propositions. The subject is produced within the discourse. This subject of discourse cannot be outside discourse, because it must be subjected to discourse. It must submit to its rules and conventions, to its dispositions of power and knowledge. The subject can become the bearer of the kind of knowledge which discourse produces. It can become the object through which power is relayed, but it cannot stand outside power, knowledge as its own source and author. In The Subject and Power, 1982, Foucault writes that my objective has been to create a history of different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects. It is a form of power which makes individuals subjects. There are two meanings of the word subject. Subject to someone's control and dependence and tied to its own identity by a conscious and self-knowledge. To reiterate, there are two meanings of the word subject. subject to someone else's control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by a conscience and self-knowledge. Both meanings suggest a form of power which subjugates and makes subject to. Making discourse and representation more historical has therefore been matched in Foucault by an equally radical historicization of the subject. One has to dispense with the constituent subject to get rid of the subject itself. That's to say, to arrive at an analysis which can account for the constitution of the subject within a theoretical framework. Where then is the subject in this more discursive approach to meaning, representation, and power? Foucault's subject seems to be produced through discourse in two different senses or places. First, the discourse itself produces subjects, figures who personify the particular forms of knowledge which the discourse produces. These subjects have the attributes we would expect as these are defined by the discourse: the madman, the hysterical woman, the homosexual, the individualized criminal, and so on. These figures are specific to specific discursive regimes and historical periods, but the discourse also produces a place for the subject, i.e., the reader or viewer, who is also subjected to discourse, from which its particular knowledge and meaning most make sense. It is not inevitable that all individuals in a particular period will become the subjects of a particular discourse in this sense, and thus the bearers of this power or knowledge. But for them, us to do so, we must locate themselves or ourselves in the position from which the discourse makes most sense, and thus become its subjects by subjecting ourselves to its meanings, power, and regulation. All discourses then construct subject positions from which alone they make sense. This approach has radical implications for a theory of representation, for it suggests that discourses themselves construct the subject positions from which they become meaningful and have effects. Individuals may differ as to their social class, gendered, racial, and ethnic characteristics, among other factors, but they will not be able to make meaning until they have identified with those positions which the discourse constructs, subjected themselves to its rules, and hence become the subjects of its power or knowledge. For example, pornography produced for men will only work for women according to this theory if in some sense women put themselves in the position of the desiring male voyeur, which is the ideal subject position which the discourse of male pornography constructs, and look at the models from this masculine discursive position. This may seem and is a highly contestable proposition, but let us consider an example which illustrates this argument. Foucault's The Order of Things opens with a discussion of a painting by a famous Spanish painter, Velázquez, called Las Mañanas. It has been a topic of considerable scholarly debate and controversy. The reason I am using it here is because, as all the critics agree, the painting itself does raise certain questions about the nature of representation, and Foucault himself uses it to talk about these wider issues of the subject. It is these arguments which interest us here, not the question of whether Foucault is the true, correct, or even the definitive reading of the painting's meaning. That the painting has no one fixed or final meaning is indeed one of Foucault's most powerful arguments. The painting is unique in Velázquez's work. It was part of the Spanish court's royal collection and hung in the palace in a room which was subsequently destroyed by fire. It was dated 1656 by Velázquez's successor as court painter. It was originally called The Empress with Her Ladies and a Dwarf, but by the inventory of 1666, it had acquired the title of A Portrait of the Infanta of Spain with her ladies in waiting and servants by the court painter and palace chamberlain Diego Velázquez. It was subsequently called Las Mañanas, the Maids of Honors. Some argue that the painting shows Velázquez working on Las Mañanas itself and was painted with the aid of a mirror, but this seems now unlikely. The most widely held and convincing explanation is that Velázquez was working on a full-length portrait of the king and queen, and that it was the royal couple who are reflected in the mirror on the back wall. It is at the couple that the princess and her attendants are looking, and on them that the artist's gaze appears to rest as he steps back from the canvas. The reflection artfully includes the royal couple in the picture. This is essentially the account which Foucault accepts.